So I welcome you now to this section 4 of lecture series of neuroanatomy, focusing on the central nervous system. And in this lecture, we are going to look at structural organization and functional localization of the cerebral cortex. This tends to be a very long lecture, and so I prefer doing it in two parts. In the first part, we look at general organization of the cerebral cortex, and we also look at now functional localization of the frontal and parietal cortices. Then in the second part of the lecture, which we'll now not do in this one, we focus on functional localization of the occipital cortex, as well as that of the temporal cortex. And in the same sitting, we look at something called the limbic system. And we also talk about the blood supply to the cerebral cortex. So combining all that in one lecture is a bit long and too much, and that's why I prefer breaking it into two. All in all, remember where we've come from. You've had a lecture on introduction to the nervous system, and there's some parts which were, some concepts which were covered there. You've also had a lecture on the parts of the cranial cavity and the layers of the cranial meninges. So you are aware about anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. You're also aware about dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. You're also aware about the meningeal spaces, epidural space, subdural space, and subarachnoid space. And in the third part, you looked at the general different parts of the brain, basically, the basic parts of the brain, so you know what is cerebrum, what is cerebellum, what is brainstem, what is the encephalon, what is cerebral white matter, what is cerebral cortex. And so in this lecture, we are now going to narrow down to that cerebral cortex, where we're going to see how it is organized, and we're also going to see the functions of different parts of the cerebral cortex. That's what I call functional localization. What part of the cerebral cortex performs what function? Right, so in this lecture, we'll be focusing on the cerebral cortex. Just to help us orient, perhaps you may have forgotten, maybe just to give you a brief overview of how the nervous system is divided. So in the previous lectures, you learned that the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. When you talk of the central nervous system, you are referring to the brain as well as the spinal cord. The brain is in the cranial cavity, spinal cord is in the vertebral canal. And when you talk about the peripheral nervous system, you are referring to the nerves. Nerves refer to neuronal processes outside the brain and the spinal cord. Depending on where these neuronal processes come from, we may then call them cranial nerves or spinal nerves. We have a total of 12 cranial nerves, the ones which are attached or come from the brain, 12 pairs. And you have a total of 31 pairs of spinal nerves, the ones which are attached to or come from the spinal cord. And we'll talk about their naming in another lecture. Maybe also in the introductory lecture, their naming system was captured for you. Now we are narrowing to the brain. You learn that the brain has three basic parts. The one outlined in blue is the cerebrum. The one outlined in red is the cerebellum. And the one outlined by green is the brainstem. So the brain has three basic parts, those three. In particular, the brainstem has three parts as well. We have a midbrain there, pons and medulla oblongata down there. So those are the three basic parts of the brainstem. There's another naming system that you need to be familiar with, which recognizes brain in terms of forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. This classification is largely embryological, but it's very important that you also know about it. So when we talk of forebrain, we are in particular referring to the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the forebrain. And the other name given to the forebrain is prosencephalon. And then we have the midbrain. So the midbrain we talked about here as part of the brainstem is the same midbrain we're talking about here. And the other name given to the midbrain is mesencephalon. And so that leaves us with the hindbrain. Hindbrain now being the rest of the brain remaining. It constitutes of pons, medulla oblongata, and cerebellum. Those three constitute the hindbrain. And the name given to the hindbrain is rhombencephalon. So these are the basic brain parts, and especially from an embryological point of view. Let's narrow down to the cerebrum. The cerebrum has two hemispheres. We have the left hemisphere and we have the right hemisphere. Apart from that, the cerebrum has this region here, which we call the dencephalon. That region there is called the dencephalon. So in the previous lecture, you learned that we can divide the cerebrum into two, the dencephalon and telencephalon. When you talk of dencephalon, you are referring to this part, that is the thalamus. This is hypothalamus. That is epithalamus. You can call it pineal gland. It's part of the epithalamus. And there's a region there, which we call the subthalamus. So that is dencephalon. Thalamus, hypothalamus, subthalamus, and epithalamus. And then the other component of the cerebrum is the telencephalon. When you talk of telencephalon, you are referring to the hemispheres. The right and the left cerebral hemisphere constitute the telencephalon. Let's narrow down to one of the hemispheres. If you take a cross-section of the hemisphere, this is what you see. You see a rim of gray matter in the periphery, and that is what we call the cerebral cortex. You see our mass of white matter inside. You can just call the cerebral white matter. And we see isolated nuclei within the substance, the deep substance. And this is what we call the basal ganglia. Should be called basal nuclei, but it's commonly called basal ganglia. So the hemisphere consists of, in that chronosection, three parts: cerebral cortex, cerebral white matter, and the basal ganglia. If you narrow down to the cerebral cortex, in the previous class, you learned again that the cerebral cortex is highly convoluted. Look at that image. We see convolutions. The convolutions consist of depressions or furrows that we call sulci. If it's one, you call it sulcus, and elevations that we call gyri. If it's one, you call it gyrus. The reason why the cerebral cortex is highly convoluted is so that we can increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex. So the aim here is to increase the surface area of the human cerebral cortex, and that's why the human cerebral cortex is highly convoluted. Now, there are several sulci and gyri on the cerebrum. For the sake of understanding how the cerebral cortex is divided into lobes, I will choose to give you a few of the sulci which are important for that particular purpose, so that we can divide the cerebral cortex into lobes. These are the key sulci that I want to capture at this point. We have this one here, which we call the median longitudinal fissure. As you can see, it runs from anterior to posterior, and it actually separates the two hemispheres. So the median longitudinal fissure separates the right and the left cerebral hemisphere. Usually there'll be something going through that fissure actually. A fold of the dura mater usually goes through there. We call that fold of the dura mater falx cerebri. Anyway, so that is one of the fissures that I want you to capture, which divides the hemisphere into right and left hemisphere. Then we have what we call the Rolandic fissure. This is the Rolandic fissure. It is also known as the central sulcus. Now I'm sure you're wondering, how did I pick that instead of any other? Yet, according to your eyes, they might just look quite similar. True, they may look very similar, but they're not exactly similar. The Rolandic fissure, if you notice, is the most continuous of them all, from medial to lateral. So that's the Rolandic fissure, which is also called the central sulcus. You may see Rolandic fissure also on this image. So the one labeled B is the Rolandic fissure of the central sulcus. The other sulcus is a Sylvian fissure, which is also known as the lateral sulcus. So that is the one labeled A. Again, it stands out because it's the deepest on the lateral aspect, moving from anterior to posterior, or relatively so. So on the lateral aspect, the deepest fissure or sulcus, and the orientation is from anterior to posterior, or fairly so. The one labeled A is the lateral sulcus, or also called the Sylvian fissure. And lastly, we have another one known as the parietal occipital sulcus. The parietal occipital sulcus is best seen from the medial aspect, which is this one here. So we don't see it nicely from the lateral aspect, except just a notch of it, that one, which we call the parietal occipital notch. And I want you to note that because we are going to use that notch, parietal occipital notch, with this one here, which we call pre-occipital notch, to join the two with an imaginary line, so that we can now delineate the occipital lobe. On this medial aspect, it's more obvious though. So that is the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separate the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So having learned those sulci, we can now learn the lobes of the cerebral cortex. There are 4 major lobes of the cerebral cortex, as you already know. The one labeled 1 is the frontal lobe. We can use this opportunity to define the extent of the frontal lobe. So it extends from here, the frontal pole, up to there, the central sulcus. So this is the anterior extent, and that's the posterior extent. Inferiorly, which is also laterally, the extent is up to there, the lateral sulcus. And medially, I hope you now understand, it will be the median longitudinal fissure. Then we have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is one labeled 2. This is the lobe inferior to the lateral sulcus. That is temporal lobe. The one labeled 3 is the parietal lobe. So parietal lobe extends from the central sulcus anteriorly, going posteriorly to an imaginary line that will join the preoccipital notch to the parieto-occipital notch. That will be the posterior extent. If we were to look at it from the medial aspect, we will see the parieto-occipital sulcus being the posterior limit of the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe therefore begins from there, that imaginary line posteriorly, or if you were to look at it from the middle aspect, then that is the occipital lobe. So those 4 are the major lobes of the cerebral cortex. However, there are 2 other special lobes that you are likely to come across. And so I want to talk about them as well in this particular lecture so that when you come across them, you understand where to place them. These are lobe we call the limbic lobe. In our lecture on functional localization of cerebral cortex part 2, that will be dealing with occipital lobe and temporal lobe, we'll talk more about the limbic lobe. We'll talk more about the limbic lobe. But in a nutshell, it refers to the structures that surround or that are edging or bordering the cerebral hilum. If you understand that the cerebral hilum is that part where the right and the left hemisphere are joined, now the structures around that point of union of the right and left hemisphere is what we're calling the limbic system. Then you will figure out that the components of the limbic system actually traverse almost all the lobes, all the 4 lobes that we talked about. So this region which are highlighted are part of the limbic system. And as we can see from just glancing through, is that the components actually span across multiple lobes. So that's the limbic lobe. In a nutshell, they span across multiple lobes, but most of the components are within the temporal lobe. So in our discussion, we'll discuss it under temporal lobe, however. The other lobe that I want to talk about is the insular lobe. So the insular lobe is this part that has been shaded in green. How did we get there? This is deep in the floor of the lateral sulcus, or what we call sylvian fissure. So when you open the sylvian fissure, you retract that down, and this one up, you'll get that one. This part of the brain that usually overlap the insular lobe to make the sylvian fissure is what is called the operculum. So this is the temporal operculum, this is the parietal operculum, and this is the frontal operculum. So this one is retracting the frontal and parietal operculum, while this one is retracting the temporal operculum, so that we can see something deep, which is the insular lobe. In this image, the opercula have been removed, both temporal, parietal, and frontal, so that we can see the insular lobe. And there's a sulcus going around the insular lobe, which we call the circular sulcus, not a big deal. So this insular lobe is actually a transition between those three lobes that I've highlighted to you. And so again, you're likely to come across it. And so if you come across it, don't start wondering which lobe is that one. So in summary, there are four major lobes of the cerebral cortex: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. In this particular lecture that you're having, we'll be talking more about functional localization of the frontal lobe as well as the parietal lobe. And then in the next class that will follow, we'll talk more about functional localization of the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. I've chosen to split them that way so that we have ease of delivery. So in the first part, we'll be talking about frontal lobe and parietal lobe. We'll also talk about histological structure of the cerebral cortex. Then in the second part, where we're going to talk about temporal lobe and occipital lobe, we'll also talk about limbic system and the blood supply to the brain. That's how I've chosen to divide them. If we say that in a different way, we mentioned that the brain has three parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. And we mentioned that the cerebrum has two components: the hemispheres and the encephalon. We've broken down the hemisphere into three. We have the cerebral white matter, cerebral cortex, and the basal ganglia. The cerebral white matter from the previous lecture, you learned that contain axonal fibers. The ones that join right and left are called the commissural fibers. Corpus callosum is one of them. Anterior commissure, posterior commissure, habenular commissure, all those are commissures. Association fibers join different cortical regions within the same hemisphere. Different cortical regions within the same hemisphere. Again, we have several examples of association fibers: superior longitudinal fasciculars, inferior longitudinal fasciculars, uncinate fasciculars. All those are different names of association fibers. Some of them are long, like the ones I've mentioned. Some of them are short. The short association fibers join adjacent gyri. They may not necessarily have unique names. Then we have the projection fibers. Projection fibers connect the cerebral cortex to subcortical regions. Either they're going to the cortex, and so we call them ascending tracts, or they come from the cortex, and so we call them the descending tracts. The ones which are ascending will largely be sensory, and the ones which are descending will largely be motor. Those are white matter. Now we're here. We've divided the cortex into four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal cortex. And so this is the subject matter of today's talk, which again we've said we will split into two. Frontal and parietal cortex is what we learn in this section. Occipital and temporal cortices we'll do in the next section. So what are the objectives? I'll give you the general objectives of the lecture of the cerebral cortex. Then we'll narrow down to what we've agreed. One of the key things that we are going to learn in this lecture is to look at the microscopic structure of the cerebral cortex. After that, we're also going to then identify the major gyri in each lobe of the cerebral cortex. So you need to know the major gyri in each lobe of the cerebral cortex. There are many gyri, but it's only practical to learn the bigger ones. Then we are going to name the major functional areas which are in each lobe of the cerebral cortex. Now, let me put it this way. We know that we have gyri, and those gyri are convolutions aimed at increasing the surface area that houses the cortex. So that means that each gyrus actually has a cortex covering it. Some cortical zones have unique functions. So a cortical zone that has a unique function constitutes a functional area. It could be covering over multiple gyri, but just one zone. So a cortical zone that may be covering over multiple gyri or just one gyri, but has a unique function is what we call a cortical functional area. So we'll give names to gyri, fine, but we'll also give names to the cortical functional areas. These cortical functional areas, someone called Brodmann chose to give them numbers, and there are over 50 numbers. We'll try to pick a few of the numbers, not all of them. So for each cortical functional area, perhaps the common ones, we will give them their Brodmann number. And then we will also state the key role that each of the cortical functional areas play. Now, because we are learning to become clinicians, it shouldn't just end at knowing the cortical functional areas like that. We then need to work out if we have a patient that has a lesion on a particular cortical functional area, how do we expect this patient to present clinically? That's important because that will then help us to integrate the functions and actually why we are learning them in the first place. Lastly, in this lecture of cerebral cortex, it's also important that we understand how the cerebral cortex is supplied by blood. Now, generally, the brain receives two systems of arteries, the vertebrobasilar system and the internal carotid system, and the two form an anastomosis at the base of the brain. The anastomosis is called the arterial circle of Willis. From this anastomosis, we have three arteries which go to the cerebral cortex. And so we'll describe the arterial circle of Willis in that note, and then look at the three arteries which go to the cerebral cortex and see what the territory of each. So basically, that is the overall lecture objective for this section on organization and functional localization of the cerebral cortex. So let's start with the first agenda, looking at the histological organization of the cerebral cortex. And because this is not the first time you are hearing about nervous tissue, I've chosen to start with a question. The question is projected to you. Take some 30 seconds, look at it, and then make a decision. There's only one correct response. Okay, so we can proceed. Now we can look at cells of the cerebral cortex this way. The cerebral cortex is part of nervous tissue. It contains, therefore, neurons, and neuroglial cells. There are different types of neurons which are on the cerebral cortex. And I've defined for you some terminologies. Interneurons connect more neurons, 2 or more neurons within the CNS. Motor neurons are the ones that exit. Multipolar neuron. Okay, sorry about that. Multipolar neurons are neurons that have multiple processes arising from the cell body. They're still in the cerebral cortex. Association neurons are basically interneurons. So all those are in the cerebral cortex. Then we have neuroglial cells. Neuroglial cells are supporting cells. Remember, microglia are the phagocytic cells, so they are expected to be there. Astrocytes help in structural support, among other functions. They are also in the cerebral cortex. Actually, there are 2 types of astrocytes. There are those that we call protoplasmic astrocytes. Those are the ones within the cerebral cortex. Then there are those that we call fibrous astrocytes. Fibrous astrocytes are within the white matter of the brain. Oligodendrocytes help in myelination. So they're also in the cerebral cortex, actually. Because remember, even if you're saying the cortex has cell bodies of neurons, those cell bodies must be having axons arising from them. And so those axons are still myelinated, depending on the location of that cell body. So ependymal cells are the ones not expected to be within the cerebral cortex. Now, if we focus on the neurons, okay, before I focus on the neurons, maybe let me tell you something on this slide. Histologically, this is how the cerebral cortex looks like. I know you may not pick much here, but this is the surface of the brain. What we see is a region that is highly cellular. Then a closer look will tell you that there's some not so well-defined zones. Just put your eye from that end, the piled surface, as you go deep, and you realize that things are changing, but you can't quite pinpoint and say the changes from here to here. But there's some gradual change in the morphology. That is how the cerebral cortex is organized. In terms of the neurons, which are on the cerebral cortex, there are 2 categories of neurons in the cerebral cortex. There are those that we call pyramidal neurons, and there are those that we call non-pyramidal neurons. And you can just classify them like that. We have pyramidal and non-pyramidal neurons. I want to talk about the pyramidal neurons generally. Before that, maybe in this image, you're able to see that as well. So this is the cerebral cortex histology. Now, these ones that look like a bush, those are actually the astrocytes. Now here, that's the cerebral cortex, a higher magnification, cerebral cortex, yet still higher magnification. We are now elaborating on some neurons. Now look at these neurons here. Those are the ones we call the pyramidal neurons. This is the highest magnification I'm giving you. And we see these neurons there. Those are pyramidal neurons. They are a characteristic feature of the cerebral cortex. Very characteristic for the cerebral cortex. It is tempting for you to think that the one going up is the axon of that neuron, but that's not true. The unique thing about pyramidal neurons is this. They have a pyramidal shaped cell body, as you can see there, in that one, or in that one, or in that one. The cell body is pyramidal in shape. The apex of the pyramid gives you a very prominent process, the prominent apical dendrite. It has a prominent apical dendrite. That is a dendrite, very prominent. It is arising from the apex. And that is the one that goes towards the pile surface. Then the axon is basal. So perhaps this is the basal axon, but we still have other basal dendrites as well. So one of those processes will be an axon, then the others are dendrites. I want you to remember that this big thing is not the axon, but the dendrite, an apical dendrite, which is prominent. Generally, the pyramidal neurons are the efferent neurons from the cerebral cortex. So they're the motor neurons of the cerebral cortex. I mentioned to you that when you look at the cerebral cortex, you see not so well defined zones. We can describe these zones into 6 layers. And I want to take you through those 6 layers. Remember, they're not well defined. The outermost layer from the pile surface is what we call the molecular layer. The molecular layer is a dendritic zone. So it's largely for synapses. We call it the molecular layer or the plexiform layer. So it's largely for synapsing. It's a synaptic zone. Then we have layer 2. We call it the outer granular layer or the external granular layer. The external granular layer is basically an input center. It receives neurons which come from other cortical regions. Now remember, neurons which come from other cortical regions would either be association neurons or commissural neurons, but not projection neurons. So layer 2 of the cerebral cortex is the input center for association and commissural fibers. Neurons which come from other cortical regions synapse in layer 2 of the cerebral cortex. Then you have layer 3, which we call the outer pyramidal layer. You can call it external pyramidal layer. The outer pyramidal layer is an output center, but it gives rise to association and commissural fibers. So it gives rise to neurons which go to other cortical regions, basically. So what are we saying? From one cortical region, we will have a pyramidal neuron arising from layer 3. That pyramidal neuron will then go and terminate in layer 2 of another cortical region. So where it's arising from is an efferent. Where it's going to terminate to be an afferent, to be an input. So it arises from layer 3 of one region and terminates in layer 2 of another region. For example, if you are to have a neuron arising from here and terminating somewhere there, then the cell body will be here, then the end of the axon will be somewhere there. So arise from layer 3 and terminate in layer 2. This one contains pyramidal neurons. That's why we call it pyramidal. How about layer 4? Layer 4 of the cerebral cortex is known as the inner pyramidal layer. Sometimes we call it the ganglionic layer. this one, sorry, not inner pyramidal, inner granular layer. The inner granular layer, this one, that's layer 4. Sorry about that. Layer 4 is the inner granular layer. The inner granular layer is the cortical input center. Why am I saying that? Because this is where neurons which come from regions outside the cerebral cortex will terminate. The cortical input center. Now, primarily, layer 4 receive neurons which are arising from the thalamus. So neurons that constitute what we call thalamocortical projections terminate in layer 4 of the cerebral cortex. Therefore, layer 4 becomes a thalamic input center. Neurons which come from the cerebral cortex, which come from subcortical regions, will terminate here, which means that this is the input center of projection fibers which go to the cerebral cortex. Now layer 5. Layer 5 is the one we call the inner pyramidal layer, or otherwise known as ganglionic layer. Inner pyramidal stroke ganglionic layer. Layer 5 contain large cell bodies of neurons, pyramidal neurons, which leave the cerebral cortex to go to other regions. Therefore, layer 5 is the the cortical output center. It gives rise to neurons which go to other regions. Those other regions are regions outside the cerebral cortex. For example, it can give you neurons which come from here to go to the spinal cord. So we call that one corticospinal. It may also give you neurons which come from here to go to the brainstem. We call those ones corticobulbar. So I want you to understand corticospinal and corticobulbar at this point. Right, the last layer, multiform layer. The multiform layer is a transition zone between the gray matter and the white matter. So it has a mixture of the two. Great, so those are the layers of the cerebral cortex. I'm using the term neocortex here because you may come across other terminologies depending on the histological layers of a particular cortical region. A cortical region that has 6 histological layers is what we call the neocortex. Simply put, the newest cortex. Now that is just based on how the cerebral cortex has evolved, if you think through that line of thought. There's some regions which have fewer layers, and so they're not called neocortex, but they're called other terms: allocortex, juxta-allocortex, paleocortex, archicortex. Those are other terminologies, but one that has 6 layers is a neocortex, and that's one I want you to remember. Good. So we've talked about histological organization of the cerebral cortex. Now I want us to switch gear, having talked about histological organization of the cerebral cortex, to talk about functional localization of the cerebral cortex. Maybe first I give you a general concept, then we focus on the 2 cortices. When you talk about functional localization of the cerebral cortex, we want to answer this critical question. Which part of the cerebral cortex performs which function? When you look at this brain, you see several gyri and sulci. So all these are lined by cortices. But which cortical region will be doing which function? Now, the best way to do it is this way. Having talked about the 4 lobes, you just pick one lobe. As we've said, in this one, we are going to pick frontal and parietal lobe. For each lobe that you pick, identify a gyrus. And I'll tell you how the gyri are named. Again, we'll not talk about all the gyri, we'll talk about the major gyri. And the major ones are very few actually, or what I consider major. For each gyrus, we know that the gyrus is lined by a cortex. So we will then give name to the cortical region that is housed by each gyrus. I told you that some cortical regions are extensive, so they'll overarch multiple gyri. We'll highlight that. But there's some cortical regions which are only on a part of a gyrus. We'll also highlight that as well. For each cortical region, where possible, we will give the Brodmann number. I told you that there's someone called Brodmann who gave them numbers, none over 50. We're not going to learn over 50. Actually, we are unlikely to even learn over 20. We just learn a few, so don't panic. But importantly, for each cortical region that we're going to talk about, for each cortical function area, it is important that we know the role of that cortex. And we can then tie that with effect of injury to that particular region. So that's our agenda for each of the lobes. This captures for you just a summary of what we call the Brodmann's areas. This guy called Brodmann studied the cerebral cortex and realized that there were over 50 different cortical regions with different functions. And he chose to give them numbers. The unfortunate thing is that the numbers are not in a systemic manner. We can't say that one starts from here and the next one is 2, 3, 4 like that. That's the unfortunate thing. So I don't have a formula of teaching you the Brodmann's areas. I don't have. But the ones that I want you to know, I'll tell you. So as we agreed, we'll only look at 2 cortices, frontal and parietal. Let's start with the frontal cortex. Then we look at the parietal cortex. So we look at functional localization of the frontal cortex. The image to your left shows you the lateral surface of the brain, and the image to your right shows you the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. The structure labeled is corpus callosum. So this is the medial aspect of the hemisphere. This is the anterior part, that's the posterior part. On this other one, this is the anterior side, this is the posterior side. So this is the frontal lobe. Let's define the extent of the frontal lobe. Down here, it extends up to the lateral sulcus. Posteriorly, central sulcus. So we have the central sulcus there, and we have the lateral sulcus here. And so we define the frontal lobe there. There are many sulci and gyri in the frontal lobe, but I want to talk about just a few. So follow with me. If this is the central sulcus separating frontal from parietal lobe, there's another sulcus that runs parallel to it, although it's not complete. I will try to avoid giving you the names of the sulci so that we use the disk space we have to just remember the gyri I want to tell you. But if you're in a practical class, it will be easier to remember both. So when you look at brain practically, you can be able to pinpoint the names of the sulci and the gyri. But from this theoretical lecture, I find it easier if I avoid the names of the sulci so that you can remember the gyri. So there's a sulcus there. And if you have a sulcus there and another sulcus here, then these are gyrus. This gyrus comes in front of the central sulcus. So we call it the precentral gyrus. That is one of the gyri we're going to talk about. Apart from precentral gyrus, now look, there's a sulcus there and another one there. Well, I know you're saying, but there are sulci all over. That is true, except that the ones I'm picking are the ones I want you to pay attention to. So there's that sulcus and there's that sulcus. If we use those two sulci, we are dividing the frontal cortex, the remainder of the frontal cortex, into three. The one above, superior frontal gyrus, the one in the middle here, middle frontal gyrus, and the one below, inferior frontal gyrus. So we've divided the rest of the frontal lobe into superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus. Follow the three gyri anteriorly, and they appear to merge anteriorly here. That point where they appear to merge is called the frontal pole. Let's have those in mind as I teach you the cortical regions housed by those gyri. Remember, I've mentioned the precentral gyrus, superior frontal, middle frontal, inferior frontal, and frontal pole so far. This is what we agreed, that for each gyrus, you need to know the cortical functional area. You need to know the Brodmann's number. You need to know the role and the effect of injury. The first gyri I want us to talk about are these three: the precentral gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, and the frontal pole. I want to talk about those ones first. Let's start with the precentral gyrus. The name given to the cortex housed by the precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. That's the name given to the functional area, primary motor cortex or primary motor area. This is Brodmann's area number 4, useful in controlling voluntary movements. And so if you have an injury to this region, then it means that you are not able to control your muscles. And the term we give to that is paralysis. Injury to the precentral cortex, precentral gyrus or primary motor cortex will give you paralysis. But I know you've heard this story that the right side controls the left side and the left side controls the right side. In our lecture on how sensations go in the introduction, I told you about neurons decasseting. Even motor neurons also decassette. To decassette is to cross over. So if I injure the left primary motor cortex, then I'll paralyze the muscles on the right side of the body. The concept, the name given to that concept is contralateral hemiplegia, paralysis of the opposite half of the body. Let's go to another gyri. The next gyrus is the inferior frontal gyrus. The inferior frontal gyrus has 3 parts. It has the most posterior part, which we call the opercular part, a middle part called the triangular part, and an anterior part, which we are calling the orbital part. The triangular and the opercular part house a cortical region that we call the Broca's area. The triangular part is area 45, and the opercular part is area 44. This region is responsible for motor speech, or if you put it in a different way, It's responsible for production of sound as we speak. We are going to learn in this lecture that there are three primary regions of the brain that are responsible for speech. There's a part that we use for talking. We call that motor speech area, which we are talking about right now. There's a part that we use for hearing, which we call the auditory speech area. We learn it in the temporal lobe. Then there's another one called the sensory speech area, which we use for understanding language. It is present in both parietal as well as temporal lobe. Again, we learn it in those respective time. So for now, we're talking about motor speech, which is for talking. Therefore, if this region of the brain is injured, an individual may not be able to express themselves. We call that expressive aphasia. The next gyrus I want to talk about is what I call the frontal pole. It's a big region indeed, and the cortex housed in that frontal pole is known as the prefrontal cortex. This extends from all those broadband areas indicated. Area 9 is the anterior-most part of the superior frontal gyrus. Area 10 is the anterior-most part of the middle frontal gyrus. Area 11 is the anterior-most part of both middle as well as inferior frontal gyrus. Area 12 is the anterior-most part of the medial frontal gyrus. Area 47 is the pars orbitalis, or the orbital part of the inferior frontal gyrus. And area 46 is slightly above area 47, also part of the inferior frontal gyrus. All that spans what we call the prefrontal cortex, which we use for higher cognitive functions. When you talk of cognitive functions, you're referring to things like thinking, reasoning, intelligence, memory, judgment, and the like. Put anything nice there. Those are cognitive functions, and that's the region for cognitive functions. The good news is that the cognitive area is bilaterally represented in the brain. And so if you injure one side, at least you still have the other side to function. So I chose not to use the term abolish, but use the term impaired. There'll be impaired judgment, impaired memory, impaired reasoning, things like that. That's a bit different from lesions of the Broca's area. The Broca's area is present only on the dominant hemisphere. Yes, the inferior frontal gyrus is present in both hemispheres, but the cortex that you're calling Broca's area is only present on the dominant hemisphere. If you are right-handed, most likely your dominant hemisphere is the left one. And if you are left-handed, most likely your dominant hemisphere is the right one. Now, if you injure the dominant hemisphere on the inferior frontal gyrus, that's where you're likely to affect speech, expressive speech, because the Broca's area is only on the dominant hemisphere. Good, so just to reorient you again, we are looking at frontal lobe, and that is the inferior frontal gyrus with the triangular part, opercular part, so that's what we call the Broca's area. That's the orbital part, which is part of the prefrontal cortex. So this is what we call the frontal pole. So this is area number 47 and 46, somewhere there. And this is area number 10, the anterior part of middle frontal. This is area number 9, anterior part of superior frontal. Okay, area number 11, somewhere there. And on this image, this is the medial frontal gyrus. Don't confuse with this one, which is cingulate gyrus. So this medial frontal gyrus, the anterior part, that's area number 12. And all that constitutes the prefrontal cortex. And we've already talked about this one, the primary motor cortex on the precentral gyrus, area number 4. So there are more gyri to talk about still in the frontal lobe. I want to now talk about this one, middle frontal gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, and medial frontal gyrus. Let's start with the middle frontal gyrus. The middle frontal gyrus, in the middle of the middle frontal gyrus, there's a region called the frontal eye field. This is area number 8. That region, middle of the middle frontal gyrus, is responsible for what we call horizontal conjugate gaze. Horizontal conjugate gaze is the ability to move both eyes in the same horizontal plane. So these are function of the frontal eye field. And so if the two eyes are not able to move simultaneously within the same horizontal plane, it means that one eye may lag behind when the other is moving. There'll be some level of squinting. This particular individual will complain of double vision, what we call diplopia. Then we have what in the superior frontal gyrus, the posterior aspect of superior frontal gyrus, a region we call the premotor cortex. Well, in actual sense, premotor cortex is not limited to the superior frontal gyrus only. It is the cortex in front of the primary motor cortex. And so posterior aspects of superior frontal gyrus, as well as posterior aspects of middle frontal gyrus, will actually house the premotor cortex. But that's area number 6. The premotor cortex, also called the secondary motor cortex or the motor association cortex. So it's still responsible for voluntary movements, although this will be more fine-tuning the movements. And so if it's injured, same concept as that of injuring the primary motor cortex, there'll be paralysis of the opposite half. Lastly, we have the medial frontal gyrus, and the posterior aspects of the medial frontal gyrus houses a region we call the supplementary motor cortex. This is part of area number 24, although area number 24 is a bit bigger than this one. Area number 24 spans more than just supplementary motor cortex. Anyway, the supplementary motor area or motor cortex is responsible for voluntary movements also, except the kind of voluntary movements here are those movements that have a temporal sequence. They're time-based. You do this, then you do another. For example, doing your signature or cycling a bicycle. So movements with a temporal sequence. Again, if injured, you are likely to have contralateral hemiplegia. Good, so that is frontal cortex. We've not exhausted everything in the frontal cortex, but let me highlight the key functions as we finish the story of the frontal cortex. Let me highlight the key functions of the frontal cortex. We've said that we can say that the frontal cortex is responsible for controlling or regulating voluntary movement. And we've seen that in multiple sites. This one, precentral gyrus, housing the primary motor cortex that initiates voluntary movements. This one, the posterior aspects of superior frontal gyrus, housing the premotor area, but I've told you the premotor area will also extend up to somewhere there. So posterior aspects of superior and middle frontal gyrus, premotor area, again, control movements. This one here, the middle part of the middle frontal gyrus, frontal eye field, still control movements. And on the middle aspect, supplementary motor cortex, again, still controlling movements. So frontal lobe controls movements. The second major function of the frontal lobe is expressive speech or motor speech, and that is housed in this region here, which we call the Broca's area. So that is area number 45, area number 44 for motor speech. This is pars triangularis and that's pars orbicularis. Cognitive functions, those are major functions of the frontal cortex being housed in the prefrontal cortex. That whole area is what we call the prefrontal area. Now, those ones we've talked about. I want to add other functions, the frontal cortex that we've not talked about, but are still important. So one is perception of taste, sensation. There's some parts of the frontal cortex which are responsible for perception of taste because they house what we call the primary gustatory cortex. Follow with me here. So this is the prefrontal gyrus going down to the lateral sulcus. So this will be the frontal operculum if you open there, and that will be the parietal operculum if you open there. On the frontal and parietal operculum, the cortex hidden inside there, which we are not seeing because the operculum is closing. But if you open so that we even see the insular lobe, now on that upper part of the operculum is the primary taste area. So partly in the frontal lobe and partly in the parietal lobe. We will discuss it more in the parietal lobe, and that's why I've chosen not to talk about it here as much. But take note that the inferior most part of the precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus will actually have the primary taste area, that part that is hidden within the lateral sulcus. Limbic functions are also functions of the frontal cortex. Now, maybe we use this one. So I showed you this image earlier and I told you that there's some parts of the limbic lobe which are in the frontal lobe. And so for that reason, limbic functions are also function of the frontal lobe. However, the temporal lobe is the one that houses most components of the limbic system. And so we'll discuss limbic functions under temporal lobe. Autonomic functions are also key functions of the frontal lobe. Now, the parts of the frontal lobe that have autonomic functions are these ones largely. This is the inferior aspect of the frontal lobe. We call it the orbital cortex. So the orbital cortex is responsible for autonomic functions. Great, that is frontal lobe. Now let's talk about parietal lobe. So for parietal lobe, orient yourself again. This is the central sulcus. There's a gyrus just behind that. So we call that gyrus the postcentral gyrus. Then there's a sulcus there. That sulcus divides the rest of the parietal lobe into two. This one here, superior parietal lobule, and this one here, the inferior parietal lobule. So we have the postcentral gyrus, superior parietal lobule, and inferior parietal lobule. The inferior parietal lobule is further divided into two. The anterior part of it, supramarginal gyrus, this is the one that appears to be the termination of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So that is supramarginal gyrus. Then the one that appears to be the termination of the superior temporal sulcus, that one is the angular gyrus. Supramarginal gyrus and angular gyrus are parts of the inferior parietal lobule. We'll be talking about those ones, including the parietal operculum. On the middle aspect, this is the parietal lobe. This is the parietal occipital sulcus. This gyrus here is called the precuneus because this one is called the cuneal gyrus. So this is precuneus. We may not talk about it though. Of course, this is a cingulate gyrus. Again, we may not talk about it at that depth. So let's fill in the gap for the gyri in the parietal lobe. We will start with the post-central gyrus. We will start with the post-central gyrus. So the post-central gyrus houses a region that we call the primary somatosensory cortex. This is area number 3, 1, and 2. The primary somatosensory cortex is responsible for perception of general sensations. Think about general sensations. It is responsible for perception of general sensations. So this is where things like pain, temperature, pressure, vibration, proprioception are perceived. Therefore, if you injure such a region, then you lose the perception of sensation. The term we use is anesthesia, but remember the concept of decussation will make this be contralateral clinical manifestations. Superior parietal lobule houses a region we call the secondary somatosensory cortex. This is area number 5 and area number 7. 5 is anterior and 7 is posterior to that one. The secondary somatosensory cortex is responsible for recognition of the sensations that have been perceived by the primary somatosensory area. Now, the concept I want you to understand here is this, that usually for sensations, it doesn't matter which kind of sensation. There'll be a primary and a secondary area. A primary area perceive, interpret the stimulus that come from the sensory receptors. So it will perceive it. If it's pain, it will perceive it as pain. Some texture, it will perceive it as that. But a secondary somatosensory cortex will be the one that associates that particular sensation that has been perceived with what you already know so that it can be recognized. This is why you'll be able to say that is a phone because you're holding it in your hand even without seeing, or that's a pen. Because you're holding it in your hand, even without seeing, you're able to recognize because you know that texture. So a secondary area recognizes for identification. A primary area perceive, interpret for perception. Not limited to general sensations, any sensation will have a primary and a secondary area. So if you injure a secondary sensory area, and in this case, secondary somatosensory area, or what we call sensory association cortex, there'll be some manifestation as well, but they're unique. If you affect the dominant hemisphere, you'll not be able to recognize sensations which come from the environment. We call that sensory agnosia. However, if you affect the non-dominant hemisphere, to be able to recognize self. So the patients present with what we call self-neglect syndrome. Okay, the other area I want to talk about is Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is located in the supramarginal as well as angular gyrus. The Wernicke's area is a big region spanning both the parietal cortex as well as temporal cortex. So the supramarginal gyrus is area number 40, angular gyrus is area number 39, and these are both within the parietal lobe. But area number 22 is the superior temporal gyrus. And so you note that Wernicke's area is partly in the temporal gyrus and partly in the parietal cortex. Wernicke's area is the one for sensory speech, which means that it's the one that is used for understanding of language, as I alluded to earlier. Now, the language here is not necessarily spoken language only, also the written language. So it's for understanding of language, both spoken as well as written language. That is sensory speech. So if you have injury to that, we are going to have receptive aphasia, which is the inability to understand language. And you understand that that will actually be difficult for learning. Lastly, we have what we call the operculum. As I alluded to earlier, frontal operculum and parietal operculum house the primary gustatory cortex, which is the primary taste area. This is area number 43. And so it's responsible for perception of taste. And if you injure it, you lose taste sensation. You can call that agousia. So basically, that is the parietal cortex, but we can make a summary of the functions of the parietal cortex this way. We can say in summary that the parietal cortex is responsible for perception and recognition of all sensations except those three: olfaction, auditory function, and sight. Think about what we said. You see the postcentral gyrus here is the one that perceived sensations. And lower part there, or in the operculum, perception of taste. So we see that indeed many sensations are actually being perceived in the parietal cortex, apart from those three. And the superior parietal lobule is the region for recognition. That's area number 5 and 7. For postcentral gyrus, this is area number 3, 1, and 2. Apart from that, the other key function of the parietal cortex is sensory speech, which is housed in this region here. Supramarginal gyrus, area number 40, angular gyrus, area number 39, and this part here, part of the temporal lobe, area number 22. So this is the Wernicke's area for understanding of language. Limbic functions are also still in the parietal cortex based on the fact that the limbic lobe extends even to the parietal lobe. And so that will still be expected, but we'll talk about limbic functions in the next class. As I finish, I want to highlight something called the homunculus. The homunculus is the graphic representation of the whole body on the pre and postcentral gyri. The graphic representation of the whole body on both precentral as well as postcentral gyrus. Look at these images here. Yes, we've said that the precentral gyrus is the primary motor area. And so that region initiates movements. But it's not that this part here will initiate movement of the whole body. Perhaps that part will just control that region of the lower limb. And maybe this one will just control that region. And that will control the head region. What you're saying is this, that yes, the precentral and postcentral gyri are responsible for both motor and sensory functions respectively, but the body is graphically represented on this gyri. So there's a part of a gyri that just responds for a particular region of the body. Now, what I want to capture as well is that, yes, in that sense, the whole body is here, but the size of the body is not what is being put here. What's being put here is more about the level of function in that body. Look at the size of the cortex that is responsible for the lower limb, very tiny, and the trunk, very tiny indeed. But look at that one responsible for the thumb, much bigger than even the whole trunk itself. So there are regions which are given bigger surface area based on the function. I want you also to capture that the lower limbs are on the middle aspect, and then the head regions on the lateral aspect. That will become key when we discuss blood supply to the brain, and we understand if we block an artery running here, why the lower limbs are the ones that are affected. And if you block an artery running here, why are the upper parts of the body the ones being affected first? This other image shows how sensations go to the cortex. Look at the blue representing sensations from the lower limb. So first order neuron go, synapse, second order neuron which decassate, go to the thalamus, third order neuron go to the cortex. But look, it's coming from the lower limb, so those ones will go to the middle aspect of the postcentral gyrus, as we can see. Compare that to the red one which come from upper limb. First order neuron go, synapse, with the second order neuron which decassate, then climb to the thalamus. Third order neuron go to the cortex, but now taking a more lateral part of the postcentral gyrus. This one also captures the same concept. For motor function, they'll be coming from the cerebral cortex going down, but the neurons responsible for muscle in the lower limb will be coming from this other side. The neurons responsible for musculature of the upper limb will be coming from there, and maybe head of the body, head, that region. So understand the concept of homunculus. Great. So that is the end of that particular lecture. As I told you, that lecture is really long, so we had to divide it into two. In the first part, we've looked at the structural organization of the cerebral cortex. When we also looked at the we've looked at the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex. So in the second lecture, which will come later, you can check, we are going to look at the occipital cortex, the temporal cortex, but that's the time we'll also look at the limbic system and also the blood supply to the cerebral cortex. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much for now.